welcome to the Westminster Institute. I'm Robert Riley, its director. I'm particularly delighted today to welcome a guest from England, Dr. Hratch Tchilingirian, who is a sociologist with a particular reference to sociology of religion and associate faculty member of Oriental Studies, University of Oxford. He's published extensively and lectures on minorities in the contemporary Middle East, interethnic conflicts in the Caucasus, the Armenian Church, Diaspora, and Turkish-Armenian relations. From 2002 to 2012, he taught and held various positions at the University of Cambridge and was co-founder of the Eurasia Research Centre at Judge Business School. Dr. Tchilingirian is the author of numerous studies, articles, and publications, and has lectured internationally in leading universities, academic institutions, and international NGOs. His television, radio, and newspaper interviews have appeared in international media outlets, including the New York Times, the Financial Times, BBC News, Al Jazeera, and Radio Vaticana. In recent years, he has drawn attention to the plight of minority communities in the Middle East, especially in academic and policymaking circles. Today, he will address the topic, Challenges Facing Christian Communities in Turkey Today. Welcome, Dr. Tchilingirian.
Thank you for the introduction, Bob, and really the opportunity to discuss the vulnerable communities in Turkey today, whose actually trials and tribulations are not on the radar of the world community in general and the West in particular, unfortunately. First, I would like to provide a historical background about Christianity in Turkey. Then we'll address some of the critical legal and political issues. And in the third and final part of my presentation, I shall provide brief profiles of the main Christian communities in Turkey today. Now, as we know, geographically, Turkey is intimately connected to the early centuries of Christianity. As recorded in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, Christianity spread from Palestine through the places that are in present-day Turkey, such as Cappadocia, Tarsus in Cilicia, Antioch, today's Antakya, where, by the way, the disciples were called Christians for the first time, and many other towns and cities. It was to the communities in what is now Turkey that Paul and Barnabas preached the Christian message. For example, Paul's letter to the Galatians was addressed to the community near today's Ankara and Konya. The letters to the Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon were intended for the people living near today's Seljuk in the Izmir province and Honaz in the Denizli province. Of course, other books in the New Testament make references to places in what is then was known as Asia Minor, and to towns on the coast of the Aegean Sea, northwestern coast of today's Turkey, where, for instance, all the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelations are located. As Asia Minor, as we know in Roman times, was a significant region for the development of Christian theology, formulations of dogma, and literary production. Within the first few centuries, Christianity spread and became a well-established faith in this region. Significantly, the first 4 ecumenical councils that defined the Christian faith and dogma were all held in Turkey, today's Turkey. Nicaea, now Iznik, in 325, Constantinople, Istanbul, in 381, Ephesus, Ephes today, in 431, Chalcedon, Kadıköy today in 451, where the teachings of these councils were accepted by all the traditional churches. Of course, we know from history that subsequent councils held twice more in Constantinople in 553 and 680, and in Nicaea again in 787, defined other theological issues that are important in world Christianity. Now, when the Seljuks brought Islam during the Byzantine period in the 11th century, Christianity in Asia Minor was already divided along language and doctrinal lines, political and military libraries, competing allegiances, and socioeconomic dissatisfactions. Many converted to Islam at the time as a way of liberation from the influence of the church and high taxes. Islam, in the meantime, gained a stronger foothold after the victory of the Seljuks at the Battle of Manzikert, today Muş province, in 1071, which gradually weakened the authority of the Byzantine Empire. Within the establishment of the Ottoman Empire, or rather with the establishment of the empire in the 13th century, and the eventual fall of the Byzantine Empire, and as we know, this was marked by the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 by the armies led by Sultan Mehmed II, Christianity became a restricted religion. Now, according to the Quran, Christians, as well as the Jews, were tolerated as the people of the book, a religious community based on a monotheistic scripture. Throughout most of the Ottoman period, Christians and Jews were treated as the dhimmi, the protected persons, or the class. They had freedom to practice their religion and had legal protection of their lives and properties in exchange for loyalty to the Sultan and payment of special taxes known as jizya. The Ottoman state's relations with the various Christian and non-Muslim subjects of the empire were regulated by the millet system, which organized them as distinct and internally autonomous civil religious entities. The system controlled and governed the non-Muslim communities through elected representatives and administrative organs of the communities under the leadership of a religious ethnarch or a patriarch. Despite centuries of asymmetric relationship, Christian communities had established a sort of modus vivendi with their Muslim rulers at the time. They built thousands of churches, monasteries, religious schools, and community institutions, many of them still standing, and many others, unfortunately, in ruins, scattered throughout Turkey today. In the late 19th to early 20th century, Turkey was internally weakened because of political, economic, and social crises, such as military defeats, state insolvency, failed economic modernization, and ethnic nationalist demands in the provinces. These internal upheavals were exacerbated by foreign rivalries and meddling. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Christian population of Turkey, namely the Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians, paid a high price. They became the target and victims of a state-planned genocide during World War I that claimed the lives of the vast majority of the Christian population. When the Turkish Republic was established in 1923, as we know, after the Turkish War of Independence against the occupying allies that was led by Mustafa Kemal, later Atatürk, more than 1.5 million Christians had been killed or deported. In 1914, Turkey had a population of 13 million, 19% or over 2.7 million were Christians. By 1927, Christians were only 2.5% of the population. The Ottoman Empire formally ended in November 1922, and under pressure from European powers, Turkey agreed to guarantee the rights of the remnants of the Christian population in a treaty. And here I would like to discuss what is known as the Lausanne Treaty, which interestingly in recent years has become a dirty word in Turkish political discourse. The Treaty of Peace with Turkey, signed in Lausanne on 24th July 1923 between Turkey and the Entente powers, recognized the new republic as the successor of the Ottoman Empire. The treaty is significant for Christians as it provides the international legal basis for their protection and rights in Turkey. A whole section, that is Articles 37 to 44, is dedicated to the protection of minorities, where it is clearly stated that Turkish nationals belonging to non-Muslim minorities will enjoy the same civil and political rights as Muslims. The treaty goes on to say that Turkish citizens, regardless of religion, shall be equal before the law. And more importantly, for the ethnic minorities, it underlines that no restrictions shall be imposed on the free use by any Turkish national of any language in private intercourse, in commerce, religion, in the press, or in publications of any kind, or at public meetings. However, over the decades, an area of serious injustice by the state is related to the confiscation of properties belonging to Christian communities and the ban on acquisition of new facilities or properties, despite the fact that the Treaty of Lausanne provides guarantees for such rights. And as stated in Article 40, non-Muslim minorities were to have an equal right to establish, manage, and control at their own expense any charitable, religious, and social institutions, any schools, and other establishments for instruction and education, with the right to use their own language and to exercise their own religion freely within those establishments. Not only they have the right to own such properties, but the state is supposed to grant full protection to the churches, synagogues, cemeteries, and other religious establishments of the minorities according to the treaty. Now, property expropriations by the Turkish state are among the most contentious issues at the moment. Any property purchased after 1936 were considered illegal and was confiscated or put on indefinite hold. This, in effect, put Christian and Jewish religious institutions under the strict control of the state by freezing the sources of their income from these properties or depriving them of their use for charitable and cultural purposes. For instance, in 1936, the Greek community owned some 8,000 properties. But in 2018, the Greek Patriarchate and its affiliated institutions had been left with fewer than 500 properties. In 2006, a new law on foundations was passed by Parliament to correct the injustice. However, it did not fully solve the problem. In 2011, instead of passing a parliamentary law, then Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan issued a decree that allowed a select number of seized properties to be returned to some of the existing 167 non-Muslim foundations. This was a welcome step for minorities. However, the legal fate of thousands of more churches and properties belonging to Christians have remained unclear in the legal dispute. They are in legal dispute or stuck in long court cases. Over the decades, the Turkish state has ignored or denied virtually all of the rights and protections enshrined in the Lausanne Treaty, even as these provisions constitute obligations of international concern. One case in point of breach is the Turkish government's suspension of elections of trustees of minority foundations in January 2013. This is the equivalent of parish councils in the United States, for instance. Ever since, Christian communities are prevented from electing bodies that administer their community foundations because the Directorate of Foundations is yet to issue the promised new regulations. In effect, this denies them the right to manage their charitable institutions. Another case is the issue of clergy education and training. Both the Armenian and Greek seminaries, the only two such schools in the country, were closed respectively in 1970 and 1971, ostensibly because of the closure of all private institutions of higher education. And they still remain closed. In contrast, more than 4,000 Imam Hatip schools for Muslims are active in Turkey today. And these were originally set up to educate young men to be imams and preachers. More consequentially, I would say, nearly a century since the establishment of the Republic, the Turkish state does not recognize the Greek and Armenian patriarchates, as well as the chief rabbinate, as legal personalities. They do not have legal status as religious institutions. As a result, institutionally, they are deprived of the right to own or register property in their name, press claims in court, or engage in any legal processes. In fact, the close monitoring of non-Muslim communities goes back to the early years of the establishment of the Turkish Republic, when an unofficial security organization was established by the state to monitor the non-Muslim minorities. Since 1923, the Turkish state has been illegally profiling its citizens by using secret race codes assigned based on a person's ethnic identity. These codes were used to disadvantage Christian citizens for instance, when serving their mandatory military service, applying to public service positions, and for admittance to minority schools and so on. In 2016, the government had verbally said, that these codes will no longer be used because they were revealed in the public domain. However, there have not been any formal decisions or legal procedures put in place by the government to guarantee that the state will no longer profile the country's Christian citizens. Since the birth of the Turkish Republic, Christians have been victimized or discriminated against by the state systematically for decades. And here I will mention a few of the main instruments that were used over the decades. The restrictions, for instance, in the 1920s and 1930s, shaped public perceptions of non-Muslims in Turkish society. For instance, the government supported campaign called Citizens Speak Turkish, Vatandaş Türkçe Konuş, which was part of the process of Turkification of society, not only pressured non-Turks to speak Turkish in public, but in certain places they were fined for speaking another language. Later, in the background of World War II, in 1941, 1942, the Turkish government decreed the conscription of non-Muslims, known as the 20 classes, including disabled and blind people. Some 12,000 non-Muslims were conscripted and sent to hard labor under the dreadful conditions to build roads and airports. Obviously, many of them died because of mistreatment. In 1942, 1944, the government enacted a one-off, unreasonably high wealth tax known as varlık vergisi, wealth tax on fixed assets, ostensibly to raise funds in case Turkey entered World War II. The tax levy ruined the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Jews, who lost all their wealth, properties, and assets, as they could not pay the astronomical amounts assessed by the government. Taxpayers were divided based on religion into 4 groups: Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and converts to Islam, known as the dönme, and foreigners. The Armenians were required to pay 232% wealth tax. The Jews, 179%, Greeks, 156%, but Muslims were required only to pay less than 5% tax. The main intention of this state policy was to transfer the economic wealth of the non-Muslim middle class to their Turkish counterparts and eliminate the dominant role of minorities in various economic sectors. More devastation came in the 1950s. This time, in the background of tensions in Cyprus, the Greek and Armenian Christians in Istanbul and Izmir became the main target of riots, pogrom, and plunder that took place on 6 and 7 September 1955. The events of September, as they are known, were instigated by the state's National Security Service, and as a result, the wave of exodus of Greeks and Christians further weakened their respective communities. In the 1960s, thousands of Greeks were deported to Greece, and a large number of Christians left for fear of their lives. In 1964, Prime Minister İsmet İnönü unilaterally annulled the 1930 Greek-Turkish Treaty of Friendship and vigorously enforced an obscure law barring Greek Christians from 30 jobs and professions, such as, for instance, medical doctors, architects, shoemakers, and tailors. Many of the institutions of the Greek community were closed: schools, orphanages, printing presses, and so on. And thousands of Greeks were ordered to give up their jobs, and some 50,000 Greeks were given a 1 week to leave the country. Then in the 1970s to 1990s, the state repossessed further properties and assets belonging to Christian communities and heavily interfered in their religious and community administrative elections and internal affairs. In the early 2000s, when the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, as it is known, emerged as a leading political force, and as we know, prominently, the party was led by President Erdogan. When AKP came to power, Christian communities felt a bit of a breath of fresh air. It raised hopes for better days ahead. And within a short time, AKP was able to move from the dogmatic inflexibility of Islamist politics to EU-oriented conservative democracy. Now, the reforms mandated for prospects of membership in the European Union helped the AKP government to bring about a critical change in the relationship between the civilian government and the military, which until then, as we know, had the upper hand in Turkish politics. After decades of torturous relationship with all levels of government, the Christian communities cautiously embraced AKP with a renewed hope for better treatment of their communities. Indeed, the AKP government initially provided a relative relief from the ill treatment they had received over the decades. Under previous regimes, Christians and Jews had been terrorized and subdued through constant court cases, administrative restrictions and penalties, and psychological pressures. Even as under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Turkey had established strong secular credentials, the country had remained essentially Turkish and Muslim, with virtually no room for other ethnic or religious identities. While at the beginning of the AKP decade in the 2000s, the party leadership was hailed for their pro-EU and reformist policies, gradually the policies and political openness were reversed. The transparency and public scrutiny that was a hallmark of the early years of AKP turned into arbitrary decision-making and self-serving style of governance, especially since December 2013, as we know, when the public became aware of corruption, wide-reaching graft, and bribery on the highest levels of government and AKP affiliates. The epitome of consolidation of power in the hands of the party in a single leader, which is President Erdogan, was the constitutional change in Turkey from a parliamentary to a presidential system of governance. Now, in recent years, for Christian communities, more concerning is the increasing nationalist and racist discourse of top government officials and AKP politicians. If in the past it was the secular nationalist Kemalist state which engaged in negative social labeling of the Christians, in recent years it is AKP as it is shaped single-handedly by President Erdogan. Now, I would like to speak about the makeup of the Christians in Turkey today against this introduction. While there are no official statistics, according to estimates and self-reported figures, less than 120,000 Christians remain in contemporary Turkey. The Armenians and the Greeks are formally recognized as non-Muslim minorities, azınlıklar, along with the Jews. Other Christian communities, including Syriac Orthodox, the Chaldeans, Catholics, Protestants, and small communities of Bulgarian, Georgian, Ukrainian, and Russian Orthodox churches are among the larger Christian presence in Turkey. Church buildings, schools, and charitable institutions run by the Christian communities invariably operate under manifold legal and state administrative obstacles and financial challenges. Ironically, Christian institutions that are even older than the Turkish Republic are virtually unprotected under the law. Contrary to the Lausanne Treaty, for instance, the Turkish government insists that candidates for the office of patriarch or members of the clergy must be Turkish citizens, and their elections are subject to the regulations and decrees of the governor of Istanbul. Restoration of churches, another dimension, that are in dire need of repair, even for small work, is not allowed without government consent and formal permissions. Most of the time, permissions are not granted, or requests are dragged on for years through bureaucratic maze and administrative delays. Here, let me present the main Christian communities. First, the Armenian Orthodox. The overwhelming majority of Armenian Christians in the Ottoman Empire, as we know from history, were victims of a government-planned genocide during World War I. While some 300,000 Armenians had remained in Turkey after the war, today there are an estimated 50,000 Armenians left, making them by far the largest Christian community in Turkey, mainly living in Istanbul. Stretching over the last more than 1,500 years, the history of the Armenian Apostolic Orthodox Church and the Armenian people are intimately intertwined. Over the centuries, a deep and rich culture, including the Armenian language, religious literature, art, and architecture, have been created, developed, and preserved throughout the church, or through the church rather. The Armenian Patriarchate in Turkey was established in 1461 by a decree of Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, who installed Bishop Joachim of Bursa as the first Armenian patriarch of the historic city. Now, Armenians have lived in Constantinople throughout the Roman and Byzantine eras. A number of, in fact, Byzantine emperors were of Armenian descent or partially Armenian. Also, scribes and students from historic Armenia came to study in Constantinople over a long period of time. A sizable Armenian community gradually took roots outside the city walls in the district of Galata, especially during the Latin Kingdom of Constantinople. In the 12th century already, the community had its own bishop. In the 19th century, the Armenian Patriarchate became the most powerful hierarchical see in the Armenian Church, as the patriarch was made the head of the Armenian nation, or millet, as it was known in the Ottoman period. And this was under an Armenian national constitution ratified by the Sultan in 1863. Following the genocide and its catastrophic consequences, the provisions of the constitution became defunct to a large extent in the 1930s. Until the beginning of the 20th century, the Armenian Patriarchate had over 45 dioceses made of hundreds of churches and monasteries extending from Kars to the United States. Today, unfortunately, it oversees only the Armenian church communities in Turkey, with some 35 functioning churches in all. The community is governed by certain provisions of the civil code of the country and the regulations set out at will by the Turkish state. Another important and historically significant community is the Greek Orthodox community. The Greek Patriarchate dates back to the early 4th century. And as we know in world Orthodoxy, it is the preeminent ecclesiastical see, viewed as first among equals among the historically important Orthodox churches of Byzantine tradition. The ecumenical patriarch, as he is known, is considered the leader of around 300 million Orthodox Christians around the world. However, while outside Turkey, the Greek and Armenian religious heads are known through their historical titles as Patriarch of Constantinople. In Turkey, the reference to the ancient capital of Byzantium is a taboo and considered a politically charged term. The patriarch's historical titles are not acknowledged or recognized by the Turkish state. In fact, the ecumenical patriarch is referred to by Turkish officialdom as the Fener Patriarch. And Fener is the name of the neighborhood in Istanbul where the patriarch is located. So in effect, the state, the Turkish state, recognizes him as the patriarch of this neighborhood called Fener. In accordance to the 1923 Convention on the Exchange of Greek-Turkish Populations, some 1.3 million Greeks became forced refugees and left Turkey in exchange for nearly 400,000 Muslims from Greece who settled in Turkey. This obviously drastically reduced the number of Greeks in Turkey. So since 2018, the Greek Orthodox community counts about a few thousand, mostly living in Istanbul and some on the Aegean Islands. There are at the moment 74 churches under the care of the Patriarchate, but not all of them are active. The diminished presence of the Greek Patriarchate is in sharp contrast to her significance and influence in the Byzantine Empire, when Constantinople was one of the most powerful capitals of the time. The still standing majestic church of Hagia Sophia, or Holy Wisdom, in Istanbul, is a reminder of the power of Byzantine Christianity. This iconic cathedral, built in the 6th century, was turned into a mosque in 1453 and made a museum in 1935. And to the dismay of the Christians in Turkey and many people around the world, as we know, in June of this year, in 2020, the Turkish government, with the full support and encouragement of President Erdogan, turned Hagia Sophia, or Hagia Sophia as it's known locally, into a mosque again. Another important Christian community is the Assyrians and Syriac Orthodox communities. The Assyrians are among the most ancient peoples of Mesopotamia and still use Aramaic, a dialect of the language spoken in Jesus' time. Assyrian is the ethnonym of Christian communities spread in Turkey, Syria, northern Iraq, and Iran, who share a very rich history, language, and cultural heritage. It comprises of the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Chaldean Catholic Church, the ancient Church of the East, and the Assyrian Protestant churches. As a result of the conflicts in the Middle East in the last few decades, there are now more Assyrians in the diaspora today than in their native lands, regrettably. Numbering about 15,000, the Syriac Orthodox Church is the largest among Assyrian Christianity, with deep historical roots in Turkey's southeast, especially in the region known as Turab ad-Din. And this region is well known for the numerous churches and monasteries, such as Mor Gabriel and Mor Hananyo, or Zafaran Monastery, which have contributed enormously to theological, spiritual, and cultural life of Syriac Christianity. The Syriac community traces its origins to the apostles Peter and Paul. For centuries, the Syriacs, and generally Christians in southeastern Anatolia, have been subjected to violent attacks, plundered, land grabs, kidnappings, even forced marriages by local Kurdish tribes, and so on. Like their Armenian and Greek Christian counterparts, the Syriacs, Assyrians too, were the victims, more than 250,000 people of this community. They were the victims of the genocide during World War I, which they call Saifo, literally meaning the year of the sword. Since the 1970s, thousands of Syriacs have left their native lands as their lives and communities have been affected by not only decades-long devastating armed conflict between the Turkish army and the Kurdish insurgent groups, but more critically, with the other Christian communities, endless legal and administrative hurdles imposed by the government and society. Indeed, all Christian communities have gone through this arduous administrative, legal, and state-imposed processes that have exhausted their energy and time. Noteworthy is the fact that against the background of this arduous relationship, in February 2019, the Turkish government gave permission, and this is uncharacteristic of the Turkish state, I must add, gave permission for the construction of a Syriac Orthodox cathedral in the Yeşilköy neighborhood of Istanbul. This is the first time since the establishment of Turkish Republic in 1923 that the government is allowing the construction of a Christian place of worship. Now, another important community are the Catholics. The Catholic Church in Turkey, estimated at about 20,000 members, is comprised of a number of ethnic and ritual branches that includes the Armenians, Greeks, Syriacs, Chaldeans, the Maronites, Latin and Levantine Catholic churches, and so on. After World War I and over the recent decades, each community had dwindled from tens of thousands to a few thousands or even less than 100 adherents, for instance, as is the case with the Greek Catholics. The largest is the Latin Church, mainly in Istanbul, Trabzon, and Adana. Its origins go back to Italian and French Catholics who had moved to Turkey from the Levant in the 1930s and returned back to Europe in the 1950s. In recent years, due to the wars in Iraq and Syria, hundreds of Christian Arab refugees have found spiritual comfort in the Chaldean Catholic Church in Istanbul, Diyarbakir, and Mersin. A number of high-profile, premeditated murders and hate crimes have been committed against Christians in the 2000s, as we know from the news of the time. The clergy have been the main targets, especially Roman Catholic priests. For instance, Father Andrea Santoro, who was shot dead in 2006 while praying in front of the altar of his church in Trabzon, and Father Pierre Brunison, stabbed to death the same year in Samsun. These were followed by the assassination of Hrant Dink, editor of the Turkish-Armenian Agos newspaper, in January 2007, and the gruesome killing of 3 members of the Zirve Bible publishing house, which included Turkish evangelicals Necati Aydın and Uygur Yüksel, and the German pastor Telman Geske. And all 3 were tortured to death by ultra-nationalists in April 2007. In fact, a few decades before, in 1979, their fellow Protestant missionary from the United States, David Goodman, was shot point blank range in front of his house in Adana. In 2010, Catholic Bishop Luigi Padovese, the Vatican's Apostolic Vicar of Anatolia, was decapitated by his driver in Iskenderun. Death threats against Christian clergy and congregations, in fact, are regular occurrences in Turkey. For instance, a Syriac priest in the Mardin region, where a small Christian community still exists, reported that he and his congregation are harassed continually, adding that people ring his doorbell day and night, and his congregation is robbed and insulted on a regular basis. In 2008, a man who wished to become a martyr locked himself inside the building used by the evangelicals in Diyarbakir, and while reciting verses from the Quran, burned Bibles and audiovisual materials. In Istanbul, harassment of Christians, graffiti on church walls, and stone throwing on worshippers are very common occurrences even today. And finally, the major or important, rather, community is the Protestant Christian community in Turkey today. There is a small Protestant community whose roots go back to the missionary work carried out in the 19th century by the Anglican Church Missionary Society, the Basil Mission, and the American Board. The oldest among them is the Armenian Evangelical Church, which was established in 1846 through the work of American missionaries. Today, there are an estimated 6,000 Protestants in Turkey, and besides some single congregation churches of mostly European origin, for instance, the German Protestant Church in Beyoğlu district of Istanbul, and the Swedish Lutheran in Tünel district. There are dozens of Turkish Protestant communities whose members are largely Turkish Muslim converts to Christianity. Since 1958, there is also a small community of Seventh-day Adventists. The Association of Protestant Churches in Turkey, established in 1989, is made of 140 small and large fellowships, mostly in Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, with some 25 of them, about 25 of them are house fellowships. They don't have churches. The rest use public places for worship, but do not have legal status as far as the Turkish state is concerned. Their beginnings go back to the missionary work of US-based Operation Mobilization Mission Agency in the early 1960s. This movement was strengthened by the return of Turkish Christian preachers who had converted to Christianity while living in Europe. They provided leadership and direction to growing Protestant communities who continually face nationalist backlash and intolerance as a Muslim converting to Christianity is not acceptable in Islam or in Turkey in this case. One of the significant achievements of Turkish evangelicals is the translation of the New Testament into Turkish and later the entire Bible, which was published in 2001. Even as some restrictions on religious minorities have been eased over the years, the Protestant congregations or groups do not have legal status or registration, as I noted. A 2017 US State Department report on religious freedom in Turkey stated that Protestant groups face numerous restrictions. Many local Turkish officials continued to impose zoning standards on churches, such as minimum space requirements, for instance, which, by the way, they did not impose on mosques, the same regulations. So now, let me conclude my presentation having spoken about the various groups in Christian groups and communities in Turkey. Now, Christians are less than 1% of the nearly 80 million population of Turkey and live as a precarious minority in a country that is 99.8% Muslim. Christians are perceived as the other or as foreigners, even as they have lived there for nearly 1,500 years, long before the arrival of Islam and the establishment of the Ottoman Empire. Members of non-Muslim minorities as individuals have been made to feel they are different in the derogatory sense of the word, as Hrant Dink, the editor of the Turkish-Armenian newspaper Agos, wrote almost a decade before his assassination. And he said, because of this negative approach, their basic weapon of defense has been to live timidly and regretfully in fear. Indeed, in 2007, former President Ahmed Necdet Sezer branded Christian and Jewish charitable trust as foreign foundations and very dangerous, as justification for his veto of an amendment to the law concerning minorities. Of course, he was following decades-long convention. In 1935, the Turkish state had mandated through the law on religious foundations that all Muslim and non-Muslim foundations or waqfs should declare the properties they owned at that time. So the foundations complied and presented a comprehensive list to the government. And the following year, however, nearly the government, nearly 4 decades later, made a ruling of the Court of Cassation in 1974 that no corporate body consisting of foreigners would be allowed to obtain immovable property. So the government in 1935 and 1936, the Christian and Jewish community charities had presented the government a list of their properties, but rather than allowing them to keep them, eventually over the decades, the government has used this inventory, this list, to confiscate the majority of these properties and institutions. So according to the 1974 law, no corporate body consisting of foreigners would be allowed to obtain immovable property. And here is the problematic area. Christian and Jewish citizens of Turkey were put in the category of foreigner. Thus, their foundations were entitled only to the properties they had before the enactment of the law. So anything after 1974, they had no right to those properties and assets. The government continues to supervise and control the foundations of the minorities through what's known the General Directorate of Foundations. And this is a directorate under the office of the President of the Republic. There are some 75 Greek Orthodox, 42 Armenian, and 19 Jewish foundations, which are entirely regulated by this directorate. Even as the rich history of Christian heritage and church communities in Turkey is obliterated in the official narrative of the country's history, the government promotes historically significant Christian towns, sites, and places as touristic destinations. Christian communities have lived in Turkey since the early years of Christianity, as I noted, with deep roots in these lands. The 2,000-year presence of Christians has produced a magnificent missionary, theological, dogmatic, liturgical, religious, architectural, and literary heritage, the traces of which are still visible in numerous towns and cities throughout Turkey. Christians are among the oldest native communities of Turkey. Today, while individually they live in relative harmony with all the rights and privileges of citizenship, as a religious community, collectively, they experience perennial legal difficulties and discrimination. If the trends of the last few decades are any indication, The future is bleak for the Christian communities as their numbers dwindle and their institutions become even weaker. The Christian presence in Turkey remains a precarious existence even now in the 21st century. Thank you.
Dr. Tchilingirian, thank you very much for that illuminating lecture on such a distressing subject. If I might ask you a question or two, you spoke of the liberalization that was taking place in the early 2000s when Turkish membership in the EU was under consideration, and that this inspired some hope in the Christian communities. However, that's, according to what you've said, all been reversed. To what extent was that a backlash from Turkish authorities when it became clear they weren't going to gain EU membership? And to what extent is it simply the product of nationalism and or the Islamist program of Erdogan?
Thank you. It's a very good question. In my view, the short answer is, I believe that when the AKP party and Erdogan and his colleagues came to power in the early 2000s, they were politically vulnerable vis-a-vis the former political system, which, as we know, it was dominated by the military and more nationalist political groups. So it suited them, to open up, to introduce fundamental reforms in the political and legal system towards the membership of the European Union, because to become a member, they had to institute enormous amount of new laws, reforms and changes and so on. So it suited also to strengthen their own political position vis-a-vis the establishment, the legal system, the political environment, and also opening up, allowing the minorities to enjoy the rights that they should have enjoyed all those years, but were denied. It also helped their own cause, as it were. So in the beginning of the term, the first few years, there was this opening until they consolidated their position. And more importantly, through these reforms, Erdogan was able to basically castrate the force of the military in changing governments or influencing the processes that take place within the internal affairs of Turkey. So I think over time, once they felt, particularly President Erdogan, that he had consolidated, he didn't need to continue with the reform, including perhaps the dialogue with the Kurds that had started, which ended, and we know the disaster of that processes. So I think the hopes and the expectations of the Christian communities, at least, did not last very long. It was short-lived.
So it was simply a matter of political expediency.
I believe so. Now, in hindsight, that's very clear that that was the situation. Obviously, there is critique and complaint about European Union being not accommodating and so on. But I think we know what the real causes of that is. There is discourse for public consumption to blame outsiders and others for what needs to be done internally, and this happens in many of the more authoritarian countries that we see around the world.
If I may ask you a question that relates to something taking place outside of Turkey, that is the deployment of Turkish so-called peacekeeping forces consequent to the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. That has to be disturbing, considering the history that Turkey has played in the Armenian community. Would you comment on that?
You're very right. Indeed, this is very concerning for Armenians, not only in Armenia, but throughout the world, because of the historic experience with Turkey and within Turkey, the Armenians, no matter what you call it, it is a genocide, but let's put the terminology aside. There were nearly 2 million Armenians in Turkey during World War I, but now there are less than 50,000. So that, you don't need to be Einstein to figure out that something awful has happened. So in that, without going into the terminological dispute, which has been falsely created by denialists, what I want to emphasize that the historical experience of Armenians under Turkish rule, having been witnessed genocide, and more importantly, a genocide that has not been recognized. So having Turkey next door to Armenia on both sides, by a regime or by a country that has not acknowledged what has happened in the past, obviously reminds and increases the fears and the concerns that it could happen again. So this is one dimension of that, the Turkish deployment, military deployment. Secondly, I think the more cynical maybe point is that President Erdogan and Turkey have brought their troops, their military presence into Azerbaijan. Up to now, they weren't there officially. Of course, they were helping, but now they have troops on the Azerbaijani territories, which means that most probably they will increase their influence in and over Azerbaijan, where not only politically, but also through their own military presence on those territories.
Thank you. Yeah, would it be correct to say that historically Turkey has always had an interest in extending its influence eastward, and that in fact it's, even though the Ottoman Empire was guaranteed its integrity if it stayed out of World War I, it thought that the disintegration of the Russian Empire gave it certain opportunities to extend its influence and maybe even indeed control of the Turkic peoples to the east. And that Erdogan is playing upon this ancient aspiration. Is that true? And does just this deployment into Azerbaijan have an effect on the nationalist support for him in the Turkish state, in the country?
Don't take my word for it, but we can see there, it's on YouTube, a speech by President Erdogan a few years ago in Rize at the Recep Tayyip Erdogan University, a university named after him on the Black Coast, Rize, where it is on YouTube. Everyone can go and see, where he talks about the Ottoman Empire and that how Turkey needs this expansionist idea that he says we cannot forget, basically from Eastern Europe to Libya, to the Levant, to the Caucasus. So he's, in his own speech, he's always mentioned the so-called neo Ottoman kind of expansionist ideology. He's talked about it, it's not a secret. And it looks like it's not only an ideology or a rhetoric, but he's also trying to do it, to expand Turkish influence, military presence perhaps, and maybe eventually more, territorial expansion. So it's, it takes years and decades, and so he's kind of putting the initial steps in place, as it were, for the very discourse, the very ideology that he's been talking about it. So it's not, you and I are not speculating, but we're talking about something that has been stated numerous times by President Erdogan.
One of those areas in which he's obviously extended his influence is northern Syria, where a number of Christian churches have been destroyed. He's made the statement, apparently, that he will restore those churches. Do you give any credence to that statement?
Look, vis-a-vis Islam, as we know, historically and in Turkey today, what they want, or what they call, is they want Christians to behave the way they want them to behave, to show loyalty and respect, and to do whatever the state, the regime wants them to do, and nothing else. So they decide the parameters, they decide how you are going to elect your patriarch in Turkey today. The government decides. They write the rules and send it to the community and say, here are the rules upon which you are going to elect your patriarch. This is a Christian church. They have their own canons and rules for centuries. So this whole discourse is, there's always the good Christians in our country and the bad Christians, or the bad Westerners, or the outsiders who are trying to criticize Turkey, or are not happy about it. So if you are saying one thing but doing something else, it doesn't match. Now, of course, Turkey has repaired a few churches in Turkey. The famous one was the Church of Ahtamar on the island, on Lake Van, the Church of Ahtamar. The Turkish government, through the Ministry of Culture, paid for the repair, but it's a museum. The Armenians are allowed to hold service once a year by the permission of the government. It's a renovated, beautiful 10th century Armenian church, but it's under the control, under the legal administration of the government of Turkey, and Armenians have to write for permission once a year, not much, not more, once a year, to go and have a service there for 2 hours. This is the type of repairs and preservation that goes on. So anything that the Turkish government has repaired keeps it as a museum. Same thing with the synagogue in Edirne that was renovated, beautiful synagogue. It's a museum. A Greek monastery, or Greek churches that are rarely renovated, they are museums under in the possession of the government. They are not given back to their rightful owners. So this is something that is missed in the rhetoric and in the media discourse.
And of course, it's rather extraordinary that Hagia Sophia is no longer a museum after 85 years. And I understand they put drapes over the Christian murals when the imams are holding services in there. Christians have appealed to also hold services, but as I understand it, that's being withheld. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there is I saw yesterday a picture, I mean, the drapes are there. I think more than whether covering or not, it's the idea, it's the change of the status from a museum into a mosque, a place of Muslim worship. I mean, the compromise would have been to allow also Christian services to take place there, maybe once a year, which was actually a proposal by the Armenian Patriarch to allow all religions to hold services there as a sort of an ecumenical historic place, but that wasn't done. I think in the West, in the Christian world, we're very careful about not turning things into Muslim versus Christian, or not to talk about religious conflict, whatever. While in the Muslim world, they're very open about it. They say, if a Muslim conquers a Christian church or a Christian city, we are entitled to that church to convert it into a mosque. And we don't say anything about it because we don't want to turn it into a religious conflict or a religious issue. But in the Muslim, in Turkey, this is the point that Erdogan made, that this was conquered, Hagia Sophia was conquered in the 15th century. So we have the right, through our ancestors who conquered it, to worship in it. And the Christian communities are talking about, not turning this into a religious issue. How could you talk about conversion of a church into a mosque and say this is not a religious issue?
May I close with a quick question about the practical difficulties of living in Turkey for Christians? Their religion is listed on their national identity cards. Is that not so?
Yes. Now, I'm not sure if recently, but they are mentioned as Christian. It used to be like they would say Armenian, Greek, and so on, but now it's a general term called Christian.
Just Christian. And so anyone employing them, or if they apply for any state benefits, everyone who receives those applications knows here's a Christian. And does that then give them an opportunity to discriminate?
No, even without the ID cards or whatever, as I mentioned, the Turkish state, since the early 1920s, had been secretly monitoring the non-Muslims, and they had codes. Code number 1 was Greek. Code number 2 was Armenian. Code number 3 was Jew. Code number 4 was Syriac. So when the time came for you to go and do your mandatory military service, they checked against these codes to see which category will you belong to. And accordingly, you were never made an officer. You always remained, a regular soldier. Until today, you're not given government high positions in government. So that discrimination has always been in the system.
Right. Great. Dr. Tchilingirian, thank you very much for your superb presentation and for answering these few questions. We're very grateful to you for joining us today. And I would like to invite our audience to help distribute this video, and also to go to the Westminster Institute webpage, where you'll see a wealth of other lectures, including others on the subject of Turkey, and of course on the Middle East, as well as foreign policy topics affecting Russia, China, and other areas of the world. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Robert Riley.